And I'd like to thank everybody for coming to another working group session on uh, uh, the supply side demand response qualifying capacity working group. Today we are going to be looking at some of the capacity shortfall penalties we received in comments that have also been discussed before in various other avenues. And so we will have some presentations by other folks. But before we do that, I want to start with a few things. We are still working on getting the presentations. They'll be uploaded up onto DR workshops along with this recording for you. If it hasn't been posted, you can always check on YouTube on the CPUC YouTube page. There's a chance it might have been posted there yet before it gets a chance to get it's posted on the website. But the idea is to get it up on the website sooner than later. You're muted upon entry, but you will have the opportunity to unmute yourself when you need to speak or are asked to speak. This is helpful if you raise your hand prior to speaking, so that we can recognize you and make sure everybody knows who's speaking at that time. We like to remind people, most of us are working from home now, or I don't know most, but a lot of us are. But you should always be aware, if you are not working from home, of your emergency exits. Make sure that you are, comfortable, that you are not straining, that your eyes, your back, and everything. All the things are well ergonomically designed. We like to remind people of that, especially in a longer meeting such as that. For your safety, if you do have an emergency, make sure you contact 911, or you may also use the chat on here to hopefully somebody to get help as well. And again, a caution to refrain from discussing any other proceedings in this case. This is not other proceedings in case commissioners are present to avoid inadvertent ex partes. Again, this is a working group. It is not part of any specific proceeding at this time, but this is always good to keep in mind on these calls. So where are we in the process? So this working group started off with a three-step BNLI discussion, which we concluded last week, and then we worked our way into the CSP, where we talked about the CEC proposal and some issues around that. Today we are talking about feedback and other proposals. As you can see, it's actually the midpoint of this working group schedule, so supposedly all downhill from there. We know it's probably not true, but so today we will be discussing the proposals, and then the next meeting, which was the first week of October, we will discuss how we're going to finalize the elements on CSP, the capacity shortfall penalty, and then go into the penalty enforcement mechanism. And then after those meetings, the schedule said we will start testing of elements from December through April. So we will be putting out protocols for that. This is our agenda for today. As we'll get into the logistics and scheduling. We'll start with three presentations, one from DSA, one from SEDMEC, and one from the Public Advocate's Office. We've given them 15 minutes each. I think for this beginning section, questions should be limited primarily to clarifying questions, because we will be having time after we get to these discussions on a short break for a general discussion of these proposals, including the CEC proposal. And at that time will be a good time to have the lively debate and conversation about all the proposals at that time. Of course, this is a rough timeline here. It could go by faster, but we'll try and stick to it if it seems to be taking longer as well. And then just a quick overview of the CEC proposal. We went over last week. I just put a slide in here to remind people what it looked like with the penalty, if you will, occurring starting at the 94.5% threshold and working its way down. what we call moderately stringent. We're trying to provide an incentive to provide the best performance and to get true results, if you will, out of it. I do want to recognize that Daniel Benal is on the call too with the CEC, and he will also be participating in way to answer questions or discussion, and possibly to ask questions as well. And do we have any questions on that at this point? If not, we can be a little bit ahead of schedule here and go right into the first speaker today from Party Proposals. And it's going to be DSA, Josh Bode, or is it Bodie? I assume it's Bode, but I think he is probably going to want to take over the screen. Is that correct, Josh?
Yeah, that's fine. And it's Bodie, just for reference, but that's fine. Perfectly. It's Bodie Miller did me a favor by teaching people how to pronounce my name.
Okay.
All right. So a couple.
Did you want to have the screen share?
Yes. So I'm going to just share my screen right now. So I'm going to do something unconventional here, which is not actually have a presentation, because I think the concept to me is pretty simple. I'm going to walk through how actual examples as to how the penalty applies, and also kind of walk through why I came up with this, because there's recommendations for some modifications, but I just want to make sure that people really understand what's going on here. And I'm going to start off with where I started off, which is trying to understand the CEC proposal, because essentially it was laid out in the appendix to the decision. I kind of put it together, and there's a whole bunch of formulas. And they're nested. So I'm going to start off with the formulas and then kind of actually move over to examples to see what happens. But in the CC proposal, what happened is they had what was basically a calculation of the shortfall, which is really a difference between the commitment and the demonstrated capacity, right? And they kind of went through and said, here's a definition of what is really the capacity shortfall, which is a multiplier, lambda, right, times a price times the shortfall. And that's that part of the formula. The more insightful piece for me was looking at revenue, because everything comes down to dollars and cents, right? So you got down to dollars and cents, the underlying formula, well, here's the price times the capacity demonstrated. That will be what you would get paid if you had no penalty, no shortfall penalty whatsoever, and then minus the shortfall penalty. So trying to understand this with the math, it kind of makes sense, but it always makes more sense when you plug it into an actual calculator. So that's exactly what I did in coming up with the formulation that I kind of put together. And I wanted to understand first and foremost what the CC formula was doing and say, well, how do we want to tweak it and modify it? I added at some point the sediment formula. I shared this with a few folks, and I want to make this publicly available to everybody to play around with, right? Just to make sure that people really understand the formulas inside out as you kind of work through this. So in this example, what I wanted to kind of show here, I only have one of these changing, but I broke it up into different components. I said, here's the capacity price. Let's make it up for now. Pretend it's one price for everything, although with slice of data, that might be different, right? But it's a simplification here. Then we have the committed capacity. In this example, I put in 5,000 kW. I linked all the formulas. So if I change anything, it changes for the DSA formulation, for the segment calculation overall, or at least what I saw from that proposal overall. And I have in here a calculation that says, well, what fraction of the committed capacity was demonstrated? Did you have a shortfall, right? If you're 100%, you have no shortfall. If you're below 100%, you have a shortfall. And then I put in the multiplier lambda in there, right? To just understand how lambda changes the numbers. So let's walk through a handful of examples here, because what jumps out is, if you have demonstrated capacity, I have a revenue if the commitment is met. So that's simply saying here's 50,000 kW times 120, that's 6 million, right? If the revenue with the demonstrated capacity is identical in this example, because I met 100% of my commitment. There is no penalty, again, because I met 100% of commitment, and that's true for all the various proposals. Now, what happens if we shift over and say, look, I gave you 75% of the demonstrated capacity? So this is where it gets interesting, right? Because what I basically say is I committed 50,000 of capacity, but I demonstrated, 37,500 kW of capacity. At the end of the day, if I had met my commitment, I would have received 6 million. If I basically sit here and there's no penalty, I will get 4.5 million, which is really 37,500 times the price, right? There's a penalty that does kick in, and the penalty is the CSP portion of the formulation. And effectively, that is tied to lambda, right? So that in this particular example with a lambda 1 is 1.5 million. At the end of the day, I would have received a payment of 3 million rather than 4.5 because of the penalty. Very explicit in terms of what's going on. That's exactly what's going on in the DSA formula. They're identical ones under the 75% scenario. Now, at the end of the day, 75% of the capacity was demonstrated. The final revenue is really 15%, 50% of the committed capacity. So really, there's a delta between the two of them. There's an explicit penalty. You're not getting paid for what you deliver, right? So if I deliver, in this particular case, 37.5 megawatts, I'm getting paid for 25 megawatts because of the penalty that is embedded in here. So very clearly, there is a penalty that kicks in. Now, before we shift over and pull in a different scenario, I want to show what the lambda does, just so people really fully understand that as well. So if I put a lambda of 0.5, it basically reduces my penalty. If I put in a lambda of 2, it increases the penalty, right? So the lambda is basically a scalar that determines what is the magnitude of the penalty, and really is really based on it really is a linear component. So it's linearly related to by how much you have a shortfall. So that's effectively what's happening in both of the DSA formulation and the CEC formulation. Now, what gets interesting here with a lambda of 1, if I deliver 50% of what I committed. So this is example. In this example, I'll be delivering 25 megawatts. In practice, I would get I committed to 50, so I basically have a shortfall that's going on. The revenue, if I met the commitment, would have been 6 million. The revenue, if I got paid for what I demonstrated for the 25 megawatts that got delivered, would be 3 million. But because of the penalty, it's 0. Right? That is the formulation all the way throughout. So at the end of the day, there is a penalty and you're getting 0 payment, but you're still delivering. You're basically having to do the job or half the job, but you're not getting any payment whatsoever for it. But there's still value delivered for what you provided. So the adequate example there is you're really charging, you're giving stuff away for free in that particular case, right? So there is a penalty that's explicit in both of the calculations all the way throughout. Now, under the segment rule, there is no penalty until you hit 50%. And I haven't spoken with Luke, so I think he had some comments about whether that would be modified or not. But what happens really in terms of the difference between these different formulations, what happens when you get below this value, right? So I'm sticking with the formulation of a lambda of 1. But at the end of the day, right, if I drop in, I say I deliver 25% of what I committed. In the CEC formulation, right, there is a penalty, but it keeps growing. So the penalty continues to grow over there. And in this perspective, it would be an out-of-pocket expense or payment, in not just simply that not getting paid for resources you deliver, but be saying, okay, now you have to actually pay a whole bunch of money back, and it'll be 3 million, right? Whereas under the DSA proposal, the penalty is capped. So it's not that there's no penalty, it's simply that the penalty is capped, right? And you can modify the cap. I capped it so it'll be at 0, right? But if somebody wanted to come back and say, well, there needs to be a bit of a additional money paid, you can put there, but add some cap to it overall. But at the end of the day, the final revenue under the DSA approach is 0, and your penalty, what you would have received paid if you had, based on what you delivered, in this particular case, 12.5 megawatts, would have been 1.5 million. You have a penalty of 1.5 million, you get 0. Now, under the segment initial proposal, which I'm not 100% sure if it's active or not, the penalties only kick in if there's a delivery of less than 500%. So it's a pretty sharp drop. If you go beyond deliver less than 50% of what you committed, you're going to have this very stringent penalty that kicks in all at once. So those are really the differences between the two. And you can play around with this. You can say, what's the modification to the lambda? What's the modification to the dollar amount that I put in here? What happens under these 3 different scenarios under different conditions, right? Now, me being me, I said, well, let's look at this more systematically, right? And the only difference in the formulation, right, if we get through all the math in here in practice, really boils down to the formula that's in the penalty. They're identical to the CEC, and I did that on purpose. I tried to use the same terminology to minimize the differences and just say, here's something as comparable as you can with one minor tweak. And the tweak was simply to put in here, here's a min, of here of the value, and here's in this particular case 0, which essentially sat there and said, look, your penalty is not gonna, you basically are gonna pay penalties, but they're not going to be in excess of what the revenue would be for the information, for what you deliver, for the megawatts you actually delivered. That was really the minor tweak. But if I were to change this formula and say here, well, let's make it 20%, right, of the minus 20% of the committed capacity, you can go ahead and do that. So there's different ways to modify this overall. And I heard 2 sets of feedback just looking at the comments immediately before the call. One of them is, well, we may want to tweak it so it's not completely tied to 100, the divergence of the penalty doesn't kick in exactly at 100% and diverge from there. Overall. And the other one is, the question in terms of like, well, should there really be a penalty or not? What really counts as a penalty? But in the math formula, there's explicitly something called a penalty. Overall, it's just capped. That's the way to think about it. What I included now, here's the sensitivity table. I actually copied it further down. This is a standard format in Excel. It not the best thing for plotting, but it's saying what happens if you vary the share of the demonstrated capacity, what happens if you vary the multiplier. And I really just focused on what is the revenue as a share of the committed, just because it's abstracts from the dollar numbers at that point and goes to the formulation. And I apply the things in the opposite direction to the CC, but I kind of copied this down here and said, okay, well, here's the same table that you see up there, but really here's the impact of the CEC formulation, right? Just for my sake to really fully understand what was happening. Oh, we had the floating window. But to really understand what's happening with the multipliers and how they differ overall. And what you end up seeing is pretty straightforward, right? If you put in a multiplier of 0.5 under the CC formulation, you end up with basically a 50% penalty if you deliver 0. And it's actually whatever you deliver, plus an additional component. If you put in a penalty of 1, it's 100%. If you put in a gamma of 2 or multiplier of 2, then it basically kind of goes down to 200%. So that's a useful point of perspective, right? Just understanding what the effect of the multiplier is. The other one that's useful here is just understanding, like what exactly is the revenue that I can expect based if I fall short of what is there. Separately, I did this comparison, and I think I saw like Lizette. I shared this with Edison and SDG because they asked me questions specific about the formula. And I saw Lizette add like a 3rd tab in here to show the CEC version of it, but which is fine. But at the end of the day, the real formulation is that cap, right? So there's a still explicit penalty in the calculation. It's just capped. You can modify the cap. If you want it, you can modify it so the kink doesn't happen 100%. Say it happens at 94.95%, or whatever the proposal was from Segment. So you can modify the kinks if you want, both at the top and the bottom. The whole concept of this is you probably want to have a linear conceptual of this. You do want to have explicit penalty. You also want to have like some boundaries in terms of that, and we can modify the math to do that. And part of the reason to propose this, from my standpoint, was very simple: is if you go down to a scenario where you have a whole bunch of risk associated, that if I for some reason end up with like 25%, I'm going to have something out of money. It will deter some of the investment of flexible resources. We do have a goal for flexible resources that's in the order of, if I remember correctly, like 7,000 megawatts statewide that just got put out. So that's going to be a deterrent, if you make them too stringent, but you still want the penalty in there. The only difference is I put a cap on the penalty. So one additional part of the proposal I included in here, I put in a different phase-in for the penalty than what the CC proposed. My proposal was to do a year 1 with no penalties, right? Do a year 2 with a lambda or a multiplier of 2, right? So basically the lambda, so basically it's half the penalties, right? So that would be 0.5, or basically half the penalties is probably the better way to think about it. And the third part was once you get to the year 3 of the implementation, we have the full implementation. It's just kind of a bit more gradual, so people have a bit of a time to adjust. But that was the other component in the proposal. So with that being said, I'll open up to questions. If people have questions, if you want to plug in a particular scenario that you want, feel free to let me know. But I think it's more helpful to kind of have this formulated this way, both so people can plug in their personal examples and understand how things move, but also so if there's a formulation, we know what part of the formula to tweak and how to tweak it.
Josh, you would want me to share this with the working group?
Yeah, go ahead and share it with the working group. I think it just helps people understand what the actual formulas do.
And just this, the CEC proposal has a 94.5% grace.
Yeah, that was. I think there's a disconnect there because that was in the, I think not the attachment, it was in the main part of the proposal, right? So I think it's in 2 different places, but we can modify that pretty easily, right? In both the CC formulation and this DSA formulation to include essentially a little bit of a buffer. The measurement for resources will have a bit of noise just simply because you don't directly measure demand reduction. You have to establish a baseline to do that. And there's always going to be some amount of statistical noise there, right? In general, you may include a small buffer there if you want. And that's what I think about when I think of a buffer. And we can tweak that to kind of reflect that. But to a large degree, I was trying to match the CEC formula and just make one adjustment to it. So any questions or comments? And I can't see hands being raised, by the way, so at least not from my viewpoint right now.
Yeah, Luke has a question.
Yeah, Luke.
Hey, Josh, thanks a lot. If I could begin with a moment of levity, I wish I had half the Excel skills that you have. This was a really cool tool.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarifying question. The lambda, does that reflect the slope of the downward, the downward slope of the curve once it leaves, I guess what we're calling the performance curve, but ultimately, off the.
Yeah, I mean, like you can define it to be a kink. This is the initial formulation based on the appendix. It's missing that 94.6, I think was number, right? Or 95.6, I forget which one it is. But it's basically, here's a kink and the lambda defines the slope. So this lambda 2 is the deeper slope. The lambda of 1 is right here, and the lambda of 0.5 is there.
Okay.
Right. So you can modify the slope of the thing. You can also modify the kink point if you wanted to. You can do what I did and put a cap on the penalties. So the only difference I made is I just put a cap on the penalties, right? I have no problem if people want to, at the top, say, look, there's going to be a buffer zone, right? Which I think is what you propose, Luke. That can be easily incorporated into that. I just kind of looked at this and said, look, we're still paying a penalty because if you underperform, there's a very explicit penalty in there. At the end of the day, the big question boils down to what should be the slope, what should be the kink points that we want to have in there, if any, right?
Yep, makes total sense. Thanks a lot, Josh. Appreciate that.
Billy?
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple questions. Where the kink point is, can you point to where that is on this in your file?
So in here, it's not explicitly incorporated in the top kink point, right? The top edge is in the bottom. So where I incorporated that is in the penalty, right? So the difference is really the only difference in the CEC formulation in the appendix, right? Because I think the kink point was put in not in the appendix itself, where the math is really in the penalty component. So the only delta between the two, you can dig into formulas once this is sent out. This is the formula when it comes to the CC penalty. I put it in words to make it easy to understand. This is the formula. If you look at the formulation I put together, I probably should change this and put it in words, but this is really like the overall, essentially the C12 would be basically, here's what you would have got paid based on your demonstrated capacity. So essentially the penalty cannot exceed what you would have got paid if you, based on your demonstrated capacity. There's only
Thanks.
a component that I put in there.
But that's helpful. But the short answer is right now, at the king point, the upper king point is at 100%, and there's no
Right now it's
ability
not.
to adjust it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
and essentially, from my standpoint, I'm open to changing that, right? I was literally just trying to sit there and say, the following, what is the appendix in the CEC calculations, trying to understand it in full. That is just probably why I didn't put the upper king point in there. And then kind of saying what tweaks need to be made to it.
Great. And one thing I noticed on your graph, at least, is it looks like this allows for values above 100% of demonstrated capacity. Like you can put in 120. Is that correct?
I think all of the proposals allow for that. Yeah, right. So if you put in 120, basically you get paid 120% of that. And there was no upper cap. And that's another consideration, because someone may say, look, there should be a cap. You can over deliver, but you may not want to over deliver without a limit, right? So that's another consideration in there, is whether or not you want to, if somebody delivers 200% of demonstrated capacity, but they didn't tell you about it in advance, you really want them to be paid 200%, right? Because in practice, I'm putting a resource planning hat on, I would want to know what that resource is, right? The year ahead, because I'm planning the grid ahead of time, not at the last second, right?
Right. So I guess my comment there is that this thing is titled CSP calculator, and we're talking about capacity shortfalls. That perhaps this is just me thinking out loud and wondering what others feel like. If you allow values over 100 here, that implies that this is not only a capacity shortfall calculator, but a whatever, and forgive me, I don't know the word, over delivering. And if this conversation is intended to currently be limited to capacity shortfall, then perhaps the tool and perhaps these discussions should only be talking about things up to 100. And it might be, it's more of a question. Is it a different discussion for values that are above 100?
Yeah, I personally think it's part of this discussion, right? Because it's in all the proposals. And who said that?
Sorry, Josh, to cut you off there, but I would just want to say the exact terminology there. You could say capacity accuracy penalty or something else, but I want to consider.
If I were to name this, I named this for the meeting, which is all about CSP, right? But if I were to name this, I'll call it revenue and capacity shortfall calculator, because it really is more of a revenue calculator. End of the day, I mean, like, that is another consideration. If I were to lay out that considerations in here, is, I would have to put the questions. Do we need a king point, a king point to be different than 100%? Right. And the thing which I've seen floated is, like, I think it was 94.6% overall. That's been the proposal that I've seen in a few different places, right? And that can be, the format can be modified to do that, right? The other question is, do we need a cap on penalties, right? And that's what really my proposal is: put a cap on penalties. It's not no penalties; it's put a cap on penalties. And what should that be? And that can be negotiated, right? It's a proposal. But to me, that made sense to kind of say, like, there is a penalty, but there's a cap on it, right? And I think the third one, that if I were lay it out overall, there's probably three of them. What is the slope? What should be the slope of the penalty? And the fourth one in there, which just got raised, which I think is a good one to raise, is, should it be an upper limit to over delivery? I think you need to allow some room for over delivery, but you may not want to make it uncapped.
That's kind of exactly why I'm asking, because if there is no limit, I would expect that people would just habitually underbid and try to over deliver, and that's not a good long term. It's not going to play out very well.
Hey, just out of curiosity, because I can't see the screen, who's this talking again?
Sorry, that was Hallie Fitzpatrick, and I'm contractor supporting Pacific Gas and Electric Company. And I'll just say I'm relatively new to this space, so forgive me if I'm asking kind of
No,
questions.
it's a very good question, though, right? In this proposal, I just simply tried to limit it as much as possible to mirror the CEC proposal, tweak it as little as possible. But if I look at this big picture, those are really the 4 key questions that you want to ask.
Yep. All right.
So
We
I'll,
can continue this. Well, yeah. Well, this is David. We can continue this conversation in the back half of the meeting. I think I'd like to move on to Luke. To discuss the SEDMEC and again, we'll have plenty more opportunity to discuss some of these details and some of these interesting questions that have been brought up. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again for you, Luke.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll let you drive if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That's perfect. And there we are. You are
Live. Okay. So thank you, first of all, to our ED and CC staff for the opportunity to present today. What I want to do here is basically just kind of give an overview of our of the DR Coalition's comments, and embedded within these is where we think this should go, and that's what I conclude with. But next slide, please. What I want to do first was kind of kick it off with some discussion about key principles and assumptions that we think should be observed. So first of all, and these are going to be a repeat to a certain degree of some comments that I made during the last discussion. But first of all, we want to make sure it's clear that we think that we should all agree anyhow that 100% precision in estimating QC values is simply not realistic. Now, we know that the PUC has declared DR as a variable energy resource, and so like wind and solar and all these sorts of things, it's going to have fluctuate from one moment to the next. Now, even with the even if we are considering weather variability and the QC determination, still, the reality is there's still going to be variations on whatever those relative to whatever those QC values are. So, and that this principle is and it's not a criticism, but it's directed toward the notion of having a 0% buffer. So in other words, having the penalties kick in at anything below than 100% performance relative to the QC value. And then the next principle is that the CSP mechanism should not be to punish or discourage participation, but to motivate realistic commitments. So, as we say in our comments, in a nutshell, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but at the same time, we have to, make sure that this is set up in a way that it's providing, an honest motivation, not to overstate things. Without going so far as to discouraging or inappropriately raising the cost of participation in DR, either by customers or by third-party providers or utilities for that matter. And then third, simplicity and transparency are key. I think, my experience in other markets in the past, one thing that stood out for the most part was that how important it is for resource providers, especially, to understand, very clearly what the risks are. When they make the decision as to whether or not to enter the market, and if they do, choose to what how they manage their participation in that market, and so it needs to be clear and easy to understand. And then finally, the rigor of the CSP should be balanced with the rigor of the BNLI. And what I mean by that is, we can make the BNLI as loose or as tight as we want to, if you'll forgive me using those terms. And if we are, and I think the example that we used in our comments was that if you are going to use a let's say, allowing utilities and DR providers to use the best dispatch over the course of a month, to count toward to be the event that counts against the BNLI. Then I would characterize that as being pretty loose. But if that's the case, then there should be a commensurately tight CSP mechanism, and vice versa. And so I guess what I want to say is that neither one of these, neither the CSP or the BNLI should be determined in a vacuum. They should be determined in combination with one another. Next slide, please. So then just want to hit on, I guess, what I think are the three primary elements of these CSP proposals. And the first is performance buffer. As I mentioned earlier on the prior slide, or as I implied, a buffer is really needed to reflect, unavoidable performance variability. DSA's 0% buffer does not reflect this. And Josh, I hear you loud and clear as to why you did not put that into your proposal initially, and even the CEC's 5.4% or 5.5%. Sorry if I get that wrong. Buffer is inappropriately based on RAIN, and is several times smaller than the utility CBP performance bands. So with regard to the RAIN, it's important to keep in mind that was, if we're going to use that as a proxy, or then we have to consider the fact that the RAIN percentage or buffer, whatever you want to call it, it was based on steel in the ground resources that can be controlled to a pretty high degree of precision. And so, as I think it's clear, demand response does not have that degree of precision for the vast majority of the time. And so, because of and therefore, I don't think the 5.4 or 5.5% buffer is far too small. And then, but that can form, one end of the spectrum, so to speak, or one, one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, I think that's fair, would be the utilities capacity bidding program performance bands. And all of those, if I recall correctly, and subject to being corrected, is that they each basically have penalties kicking in at below the 75% performance level. And so understanding that maybe that is sorry, I'm blanking on the reasons why that might not be, that might be too loose. Then what we were proposing is something in the middle of the two, which would be about 15% performance buffer. And now in terms of the shape of curve, we I'm very happy to back away from our earlier proposal from phase 2 of the DRQC working group. And I think the idea of a straight line from the performance curve down to the x-axis makes a lot of sense, and recognize that both the CC as well as the DSA proposal utilizes that approach. And this ties into one of the principles where we want to have consistent, clear risk associated with underperformance. And so I think the straight line curve does a good job toward that. And then finally, the intersection with the x-axis, we support the DSA proposal because it for both pieces of it. First of all, the intersection point at 50% of performance. So in other words, no compensation will be awarded for anything less than 50% performance. And the reason for that is because, really, if you're not able to perform, deliver 50%, then they're pretty serious problems. They said that's with the utility of the DR providers assessment methodology for what they can deliver. And then also in the as I discussed last week or last session, that curve or that line should not extend below the x-axis. So in other words, penalties would never exceed potential revenues. And and Josh did a good job of demonstrating that. And next slide, please. So, as I said, as I implied earlier, my skills are far more primitive than Josh's. So, but I did this, by hand here. But this is the red line basically shows what we have in mind, and so it's just like what DSA put together. The exception being we utilize the 15% buffer. And that's all I have. Any questions, comments, Josh? Josh, do you want to speak? You might be on.
I think it might be.
You sound like a mile away.
Can you hear me now?
You're coming in and out a little bit.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well at all.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
No.
Yes. Now we can.
Josh?
Yeah, I was trying to hook up somewhere else. Can you guys hear me right now?
Yes.
Now you're good.
Okay. I always have a problem with the WebEx audio. I'm not sure why. But I wanted to ask a clarifying question. Your graph here implies that there's a cap that does not allow for overperformance. I'm kind of curious if that's intentional.
Yes. Yeah.
So
And the
that you
reason-
have asymmetry in the fact that if you delivered 105%, you would only get paid for 100%.
Right. Because, and I think someone mentioned earlier, forgive me if I for forgetting that, but ultimately what we're talking about here is this is capacity that's procured in for the future delivery, and so any excess production during an event, that's certainly worthy of the the energy payment for whatever's delivered, but that the value of that energy and the value of that capacity is pretty minimal, because it's it could be a thing where that's some of it is you might get some excess production one day to the next or something like that, but that has no real capacity value. It's only energy value.
Now that seems to run a bit counter to your earlier point that you have noise in the estimation. Because if you're going to capture noise, right, you want to go both ways. You may want to sit there and say, like, here's a 15% up and down band, so that you capture that noise on a year-to-year basis.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have asymmetry in the noise.
Yep. I get that. I don't necessarily see the need to have symmetry in that area, because again, capacity is what you can reliably deliver. That's what capacity has to be, right? It has to be the energy that you can reliably deliver when called upon. And so if you don't know that if you're going to deliver that overproduction, if that's not something that the buyer of that capacity can count on, then it has no value to them from a capacity standpoint. It's not something they can use to reduce their to meet their RA requirement or anything like that. Now, certainly it can improve the QC valuations, going forward, because they show that they're delivering, more than what they're committed. That's obviously a good thing, but I don't know how that works from the perspective of resource planning. Now, there's also the element of the question of how would this get handled, in real life, and so I'm not claiming to be an expert on this particular element of the business, but if I'm approaching an LSC and I'm saying, well, I can sell you 10 megawatts of capacity, let's say, and at X price, and we agree on that. But if I produce more, in some given months, but then you owe me a higher capacity payment. even though you're not able to claim that capacity in your month ahead or year ahead showing. And so I'm not sure how that works out. I don't know if an LLC would ever agree to that, honestly.
Okay. We'll like earlier, like I said, we'll be able to continue this on the back end of the meeting here. But let's go. I'd like to go to our next presenter. We'll obviously have more time for questions.
Actually,
The Public
David,
Advocate's Office. Oh, I'm sorry.
David, I'm sorry. Would you advance to the last slide, please?
Oh, there's one more. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I just want folks to have my email address in case they want to reach out. Thank you.
And I should mention, by the way, I think I mentioned at the beginning, but we will get I will also send out this presentation to the group after the meeting, but it'll also be available on the website. So the last participant, they don't have their own proposal, but they do have considerable thoughts on this, as we asked them to present their thoughts on this. It's the Public Advocate's Office, and I believe, Patrick, are you the one who will be speaking? Or is it Stephen?
I'll start and Stephen will come in a later slide today.
Okay, you're a little light, a little quiet.
I'll try using my radio
Okay.
voice.
Okay, you're better now. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm Patrick Cunningham of the Public Advocate's Office. I'm on the resource adequacy team, one of the leads there in the resource planning section. Yeah, working a lot on RA issues and staying involved and up to date on demand response as well. And I'll pass the mic to Stephen a moment so he can introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Patrick. Stephen Costello, Public Advocate's Office as well. Work on customer programs, DR mostly. I think I know a lot of you. So, Patrick.
Cool. Yeah. Can we go ahead to the next slide, please? Quick agenda, so that won't take too long. Yeah, we'll go into our positions about penalties and how they relate to ratepayer impacts and reliability. And also, Stephen will hop back on after in a later slide to talk about a demand response auction mechanism lesson that we've learned. Next slide, please.
Whoops. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Cal Advocates recommends that the CSP include a severe penalty system to mitigate the risk of overestimating a qualifying capacity. And this is appropriate for an incentive-based approach, since a QC can be selected by a demand response provider rather than be developed with standardized data, as in load impact protocols. And DRPs will be able to use a capability profile, of course, to support a proposed qualifying capacity, and that must meet certain criteria that's going to be set by the CEC, or we'll see what the final proposal ends up with. However, that profile may be designed by the DRP itself and could support a QC above expectable performance, or what other metrics like the LIP process would support. And we're concerned that a qualifying capacity that fails to accurately state the capability of demand response could harm the reliability of the entire grid. QC values have to represent a resource's expected deliveries so that the CPUC and the ISO as well can determine the volume of resources available to meet reliability needs day to day and on month-ahead showings and all that. A penalty can put downward pressure on selecting a QC, of course, since the DRP would want to avoid those penalties, and that would make the QC more representative of how much load we can consistently expect to be reduced by the demand response resource. Yeah, and an incentive-based approach also creates economic incentives that encourage the selection of a higher QC. Contract payments and overall profits can increase if the QC increases, and the ability for a DRP to select a QC enables this opportunity for higher revenues to come in. A penalty is an essential counterweight to that economic incentive, and that helps ensure that the QC is representative of expectable performance. Not perfect performance, though. I agree with Luke. And the DRP loses the incentive to prefer a higher, more speculative QC when penalties appropriately balance out what the resource's higher revenues could be. A weak penalty would fail to mitigate the incentive for a higher QC, and that could increase ratepayer costs and weaken the reliability of the grid. That's the last bullet point here. We also want to urge the working group to consider exactly what revenues a penalty would apply to, namely if those revenues would include Kaiser dispatch revenues in addition to monthly capacity payments. Josh, thank you very much for the worksheet. That's helped clear some stuff up. I was looking around a lot for more information on revenues in the record. And we're hoping that the treatment of revenues also is clarified a bit for how IOU-owned resources whose funding is approved through the CPUC and gets handled through the Energy Resource Recovery Account, making sure that those revenues are handled in an apples-to-apples manner. For now, I'm going to hand over the presentation off to Stephen to go over an example on the next slide, please.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. So I really just wanted to highlight a particular example of behavior seen in the demand response auction mechanism. And it has to do with over-reporting of QCs, what appears to be over-reporting, and how that can increase revenue. And such that more severe penalties can mitigate this risk. So all the numbers here are, made up, but or anonymized basically. But this was behavior that was witnessed from multiple parties. In DRAM, all resources had to dispatch in August. Basically, that was for testing purposes essentially. So, or for the pilot purposes for learning. Other months could be substantiated just with market bid data. So in this example, we have a hypothetical contract for 25 megawatts, and the DRP reports that on their supply plan in July, and says that they had that available in July based on bid data, with no actual dispatch. Next month, they only demonstrate like 14, get paid for showing less because there was a test. But then the next month, we go right back to what was on the contract, even though we have evidence from a full dispatch or test that shows that capacity is not there. So I think we should be considering, like, this is one issue we should consider as far as how penalties can help alleviate this type of issue. And I see a hand went up from Daniel.
Yeah, I wanted to confirm whether the thought here is that this DRAM example, if there's worry that this extends to either the BNLI case or the PAM and BAM input. For the CEC's proposal, at least, there would be no invoice justification that was based exclusively on market bids. We can share again the proposal that was the original proposal. And I think in the second chapter, we go over on that specific point, that if there is no dispatch, you would not be awarded demonstrated capacity. And maybe that topic, maybe that sort of missing link needs a little bit more discussion in this working group. But I would recommend for this specific concern, referencing the original CEC proposal.
I take it. I will. I will look at that. And I think there are multiple ways to address this, but just want to highlight it. Thank you for that.
I think that wraps up our presentation. Appendix graphics that we're probably all very familiar with.
Josh, do you have a question? Your hand's still raised from before.
I think I never put my hand down. Overall, apologies for that.
I see Luke had his hand up.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that anybody disagrees that we need a penalty structure. You know, the council was, I think, the first one to advocate for one at the CC working group, and so I think we're on the. Looks like we're on the same page there. And obviously, the devil's in the details, and we can kind of, you know, hash out what those are going to look like over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, a lot of different working gizmos going on, like tolerance bands and any incentives above the QC. Definitely things we're interested in, and definitely leaks into how the penalties will work out. Yeah.
There's are there any other comments or questions for the Public Advocate's Office? If not, we're pretty much on schedule. So why don't we convene back here in 5 more minutes? We'll call it 4:05 and see you. We'll see you all back then. Okay, I think we can get started again. First of all, I want to thank the presenters in this panel, if you will, or for the first part of this meeting. I think it was interesting, and I think just my initial thoughts is that there's a lot more agreement than disagreement, if you will. Certainly, it's more of a matter of scale as opposed to form, if you will, of certain aspects of it, I think. And people are free to disagree, but it seems like at least for the presenters, and there may be people on the call who have different opinions, but from the comments we received, that the idea of a declining CSP, or if you will, a downward sloping penalty to whether there's a penalty, a negative penalty, if you will, or negative revenue, is part of the debate where it intersects the x-axis, and then also, how much of a buffer should there be? 94.5, 15%, no, 0, and then also the idea of maybe overperformance. So, these are all interesting areas of discussion. I think one of the more obvious ones is the idea of going below the x-axis, if you will. The idea of whether it's, you want to call it extra punitive, or if you want to call them penalties. I think the concept of the penalty is a little ambiguous here. If you're receiving less revenue than you would normally receive because of due to underperformance, you can be considering that part of the penalty. But some other people think a penalty is actually owing money at the end of the day, like going below the x-axis. And I'm just curious if if there's any. I know Josh, you mentioned your proposal is at 0 after 50%, but you did mention that you were possibly amenable to some sort of going below that at some point. Not in the severe way necessarily, but
yeah, I mean,
do you think there is a possibility for there to be some extra some penalties that are beyond the taking place of all the revenue?
Well, for me, I'm open to that, right? But I think like it's going to be an outcome of the group discussion, or like realistically. I put that proposal out there because I thought it was an in-between proposal of what the
here. You have a question in the chat from Gil. It's a question for Luke and Sedmec. Does the effective revenue go down to 100% if performance falls below 50%? I'm a bit confused by the dashed line. So,
yeah, basically, Gil, if the does the effective revenue go down 100%? No, can you hear me?
Yeah, I apologize to Josh too, because I took my headphones out and I forgot to put them back in, and so I thought I couldn't hear anything.
Josh, do you want to finish your thought first?
Yeah, I apologize on that.
No problem at all. Josh, I'm happy to give you the floor if you want to finish your thought, or you can come on after me. Okay, not hearing anything from Josh, I'll just respond to Gil. So Gil, what I was going for here is basically the revenue becomes 0 if you go to 50% or less, and so it's no different than what DSA had,
Yeah, I think the confusion here is that there was an earlier proposal that is represented in the table that we've just shared that isn't accurate to what Luke is now proposing. From what I understand, Luke's proposal right now is pretty much identical to DSA's, except for that it has a 15% buffer.
That's correct.
And a cap at 100%.
And a cap at 100%. Yeah, that's important.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it sounds like Luke modified his proposal after seeing the other proposals that came out, right? Which is fair, right? Because it's the iterative process. You know, at a high level, I think like Luke's proposal is perfectly fine, right? Like it's a modification of mine. I really don't have a big push in terms of what are the specific amounts of the penalty, right? Overall, you know, whether you want to cap it at 0 or go a bit below 0, because I think that's negotiable and it's more of an outcome of the group. You know, I do think it's helpful to throw a calculator, and we can modify that calculator to kind of allow for upper caps, lower caps, difference in the slope, right? Differences in the buffer in terms of that, so that folks can better understand the implications. You know, my recommendation here would be to effectively kind of gather information, say where do people end up across the 4 key questions that are out here, and kind of play around with a calculator that allows them to understand the implications of it. Ultimately, you know, it's like you can debate where things are, but there has to be room for negotiation here. So
Yeah, and I would also suggest, I mean, I'd love to hear from the utilities, you know, with all due respect, you know, I've been very kind of disappointed by the, you know, relatively low participation among, you know, at least some of the utilities anyhow. We'll name names, but, you know, what do the utilities feel like? I mean, what do they want to pay for penalties? Or is it a thing where they are just planning to pass them off to ratepayers, as PG&E had proposed in their DRR application?
So this is Amy from SCE. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. So in SCE's comments, you know, we did not have any preference to any specific BNLI proposal. You know, as we go over this CSP or capacity shortfall penalty proposals, you know, I think we're still of the position that we'd like to see how like it's actually going to work with real data, right? So we're kind of reserving our position once we get an opportunity to apply real data to these scenarios, so we have a better understanding of how it's going to fall out, right? I know like a lot of these are hypotheticals, and I really do appreciate the you know, Josh's Excel spreadsheet, like you, Luke, you know, I'm glad someone put that together because I don't think I could have done that. So yeah, I really do appreciate, you know, getting to put different scenarios in, but I think we'd like to see how this is going to work out with our data and, you know, understand like what are going to be possibly outlier scenarios so that whatever it is that we choose, you know, we're not put in a position later like, oh, well, we didn't expect this situation to happen and these unintended consequences, and now we're scrambling to either undo it or something like that. So that's why we're really kind of right now, I'll say, you know, I think by your definition, Luke, sitting on the sidelines to wait to see what's going to happen.
Amy, so first of all, thank you. And I'm not, you know, I don't mean to sound frustrated, you know, or not, I am frustrated, but I'm not directing it at you personally. I just want you to know that this is the time right now when this stuff gets decided. This is how the process works, you know, like, yeah, we'll have opportunities to submit comments and all this sort of thing. But this is the point at which we can make arguments to ED and CC staff. And I'm sorry, guys, for talking about you like you're not there. But you know, this is where, you know, we all need to get involved and put our ideas out there. And I understand the need that you identify to kind of, you know, look at some specific scenarios with real numbers and all that sort of thing. I totally get that. But at the same time, you know, we're all, you know, we've been in the business, we've all been in business long, you know, for a pretty long time. And the question, a very simple question I would love to hear from the utilities: do you support paying penalties, or your ratepayers paying penalties, or your shareholders paying penalties greater than 100% of the value of the capacity. And, I'm up here, on the front lines, trying to fight for that, curve not going below the x-axis. And I get the impression the utilities don't care. And if that's the case, I don't know why that is.
Hey, Luke,
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw the comments, but my observation is that the utilities tend to speak out in writing because there's a whole bunch of internal stakeholders within each utility in different departments. But the information that got sent out right before the meeting had comments from SDG&E and from Edison, if I remember correctly, indicating that they like the proposal I put together. And obviously that proposal can shift, but I put that proposal out intentionally because I saw the two initial proposals that came out of the CEC working group as needing a middle ground, right? But I would suggest, that my guess is that the utilities need to deliberate internally before they can put anything forward. They're not going to talk off the fly on the phone call.
Yeah, well, and in addition to that, thanks, Josh. Luke, I understand where you're coming from. I think the thing that isn't clear to me yet, right, is I don't want third parties to be double, triple penalized, right? So you had mentioned the capacity bidding program, payment bans, right? And it's so would this be in lieu of those payment bans, or are these in addition to the payment bans? How does this work with, RAIN penalties if we don't get, I hear what you're saying about third parties don't get the RAIN exemption, and I really do hope that, the CAISO does submit for RAIN exemptions for demand response resources soon. But I think that we are concerned about the impacts to ratepayers and third parties or demand response providers. And I just didn't think that we were there yet, because I thought the application of the penalty was in the third phase of this. So I apologize if we're talking about that now.
No, it's okay. My understanding is that the utility programs, and this is my understanding, is that the program tariffs, they would remain as they are. I mean, well, subject to whatever the utilities decide to do, of course, that's your right. But utilities would be subject to any penalties associated with underperformance of their own programs. Now, how you decide to trickle that down, pass that down to, DR providers through, the CPP tariff or the BIP tariff or whatever kind of tariff, or your own, customers for direct enroll programs, that's going to be, up to you to decide, right? That's your prerogative. But then otherwise this whole, methodology would also apply, of course, to, bilateral RA contracts that third-party providers have with LSCs. That's how I interpret how this would all be applied. So to your question about, okay, well, I'm glad we're having this conversation. This is very productive. And so the CBP is just going to be, there's no double, I'm hoping no double penalization.
I mean, isn't the capacity bidding program just simply an aggregation of aggregators? It's essentially a standing offer for any aggregator to say, hey, I want to join, but I don't want to take the risk directly.
Right. And I think that's where I didn't know if it was in this phase or the next phase we would be talking about who is exactly responsible for paying the penalties, right? Is it on the load serving entity? Is it on the scheduling coordinator? Is it on, and I thank you, Luke, for your perspective. Is this something that does eventually flow through and, through the either bilateral or capacity agreement that, for which the LSC has, that agreement with the third party or demand response provider. those are things that are kind of all rattling in my head, and I, would think that through this process we would get to address.
Yeah, and certainly the next topic, the penalty enforcement mechanism.
David, your screen is being shared. I'm not sure if you were intending to do that.
Oh, geez, you're right. Thank you, George. So we'll be discussing the penalty enforcement mechanism. There are a lot of questions and issues there, as Amy, as you mentioned, and certainly I think everything, as we mentioned before, everything from the BNLA to CSP, even to the PDM, penalty enforcement, they don't all exist, in a bubble, so to speak. There's certainly relationships between them, and so when we do start discussing the penalty enforcement mechanism, as we can do here, but also, some of these hopefully questions will either become more clear or become answered. But, I think those questions are valid and interesting to be considered.
If I just wanted to chime in, I think that there are a couple for the second point, Amy, that Amy was making. I think we are going to be talking more about that in the next module, this like performance, or sorry, the penalty mechanism, in terms of how that shakes out. And then to the specific data, I think we can delay a little bit about the specifics on the lambda scalar or the exact. I think there are fundamental things that we can identify, like, do we want to incorporate a penalty cap in this capacity shortfall penalty? Do we want to incorporate a buffer of some variety, both on the upper end and the lower end, to account for uncertainty in the measurement? And I think we can think about the three different proposals: the CEC's current proposal, the DSA proposal, and the updated SEDMEC proposal as sort of different severity of that penalty, and then sort of frame our comments for the next week around like those principles. But hopefully that's helpful. I do think we will get the data, and I think we will be able to play with the specific values when we have that data in that final stage. Josh, yeah, to see you.
Yeah, I don't know if Stephen was before me or after me, but I'll go ahead forward. I had two questions. They're both procedural. One is, would it help if I redid that calculator to explicitly also say, here's a cap, and explicitly kind of put that as an option that people can do, and also here's the buffer overall, and just recirculate that so people can play around with it? Because I do think that the math examples are not as useful to people. It's more useful for people to plug in numbers and see what the examples are. So this is a broad question to everybody, because it doesn't seem too hard to kind of modify that calculator to explicitly call out the decision points as inputs so people can play around with it.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And then also sort of updating the SEDMEC the column and formula there.
Yeah, well, I think the segment formula came in after I submitted the proposal, so
No,
it's
totally.
the first time anybody's seen it.
No.
The second question I have is also procedural. I drafted that proposal that we submitted for this relatively quickly, right? And right now we're getting feedback from folks. Is there going to be an opportunity to revise that proposal to reflect some of that feedback? Like, for example, the feedback about how do we deal with reliability resources, right? Things like that.
So we do have a comment period for these presentations today, for people for next week. Are you talking about, is there going to be another comment period for kind of an overarching kind of comment?
No, just broadly, David, if you recall, I submitted a full written proposal end to end in less than a week. right? Very quick turnaround. There's probably a couple typos in there. I think it'd be worthwhile if there's an opportunity to clean that up to reflect some of the feedback we received during this process, and to people say, here's like a revised, clean proposal that people can look at. Because there's been some very useful comments in this discussion, which I think could better allow for a better proposal that covers, for example, questions that were not addressed, or just refines a few different points. And I'm actually thinking about the written proposal that I submitted end to end.
So in the next module, the penalty enforcement mechanism, we do have a couple of comment opportunities.
Mhm.
So we may be able to expand maybe the last one into kind of like to include, if you want to make broader, more general, more all-encompassing comments, which it could include if you wanted to submit a revised proposal for people to consider. I think
Yeah.
that's certainly something. It's probably a good idea. And we'll consider it. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't do it, but just need to figure out how it would go into our schedule.
Yeah, and I think that can happen at any point, but I do think that simply to reflect the comments received, and I think you guys kind of proposed earlier for the testing phase to test out both the PAM and BAM approach, right, to tackling that, and also, and obviously the CSP decision you guys can reach, because I think there's pretty close to consensus here, is minor differences, right? But I think that's the portion where we probably want to update that to make sure people have in writing, here's the latest thinking, here's the process. So when we get to the testing phase, it's clear what we're testing. Because I like to incorporate some of the feedback into that for the testing phase.
Yeah, I think we're planning on preparing that as well for the BNLI paradigm, and I think from the staff side, happy to work with you on that and share that with the full working group so that everybody knows exactly what we are using, both the PAM-BAM paradigm and the BNLI one. Make sure that everybody's on the same page with what we're going to be using.
Mm-hmm.
So yes.
Stephen?
Thank you. I just had a question because I saw some ISO folks on the call, so sorry to put you on the spot. If the ISO had any opinion on a mechanism that like incentivizes over performance.
Eric, or do you want me to take that, Eric? This is Jill Powers.
You go ahead, Jill, and can chime in if you want.
I think based on our previous comments, it is not something that we agree with in terms of what we would like to see. Our bids and performance to those bids. We are somewhat concerned with, an over-performance incentive because it might incentivize non-compliance to a dispatch. So it's not something that we kind of hold on to as something that we would promote in this context.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
It's okay.
Colin?
Hi, this is Colin Smith from LEAP. I just wanted to quickly go back to something I think you said, David, about there being ambiguity about what constitutes a penalty, whether a penalty that doesn't require out-of-pocket payments actually amounts to penalty. I just wanted to clarify that from LEAP's perspective, and I believe the perspective of most of their demand response providers on the call. There is no ambiguity. If you're not being paid for capacity provided, that is very much a penalty. LEAP and other DRPs depend on the revenue from capacity payments and dispatches to pay administrative costs, pay its employees, cover other expenses. DRPs are businesses. And so if LEAP gets no revenue, from its dispatches, even if you're hitting, if the range of performance at which LEAP is no longer paid is expanded, that very much would constitute a penalty, because it would ultimately cause our revenue to go under our costs. And so there's a very a real business impact of any sort of penalty structure. Right now, in my mind, all we're really discussing is different severities of penalties.
Yeah, thanks. I understand. I completely get that and understand. And I just wanted it to be known that the wording can be a little difficult sometimes, but I understand exactly what you're saying. And I'm not trying to dismiss any kind of loss of revenue that would occur as not being a penalty necessarily, but I just trying to get us on this, everybody thinking about certain concepts in certain ways.
Yeah, not trying to police your word choice, David. I just figured I would point that out, because I do think it's been a difficult topic.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. There's one thing that I wouldn't mind the people who have proposals discussing the frequency of the measurement, because it's related to the the BNLI or the DSA PAM measurement. The frequency or the aggregation of maybe those events and how it relates to CSP, because there's an argument that if you have multiple events or things like that, they tend to the error in it will tend to wash out, as the law of large numbers would indicate, that you tend to get to your expected value. But if you start doing individual, that's where a lot of the discrepancy will come in. I'm just curious as to what people's thoughts are on the BNLI or the measurement versus the CSP. Luke?
Yeah, thanks, David. We've talked a little bit about this, and I feel like monthly is too granular. And the reason I say that is because when we are thinking about, opportunity costs of DR participants, and even from the perspective of, utility having, work for utility, or from, the perspective of the DR provider, you want to make sure that you're using your, your resources when they're going to be of greatest value. Now, if we're weather doesn't change that much from 1 month within a given month, setting aside, weird fluctuations here and all that sort of thing. But when you look at it from a quarterly level, then the weather can change significantly. And just to use the simplest example is doing like so your Q1 is what is April through May. So then like Q3, June, July, August. Okay. So by doing using just Q3 as the easiest example, you might get a couple, some warm days in June. That's certainly possible. But really, you're looking at making sure that your, resources are going to be used definitely the most in August. Assuming that the weather, patterns are consistent from one year to the next. And so that's when you're going to get a lot more dispatches, a lot more data points. And whereas if you do it on a monthly level, and I'm going to use the opposite extreme to make my point, January, February, or even like April or May, requiring someone to either utility or DR provider to dispatch their programs when they're just not needed. When ISO prices are $50 or whatever, that's not an optimal outcome either. And for someone to do, maybe they have to do a couple of events, in May, for instance, and so each of which provide no real value, or at least less value to the grid, given the low energy prices that are typical around that time of year. And so I think doing quarterly gets you more data points and allows utilities and DR providers to use their DR when they're going to provide the most value. Thanks.
And Luke, can you refresh my memory? Because you talked about what is the RAIM and the CBP? How do they?
The CBP is a monthly nomination, if I recall correctly, and the RAIM is a separate thing. That's just basically, and you know, Jill, if I'm getting this wrong, please jump in. It's basically a mechanism that's applied to you know, RA resources based on their performance relative to their RA or their NQC values, and that's on a monthly basis. Sorry. I just want to finish my thought, David, if you don't mind. The CBP is though you know, that's on a monthly basis, but you know, that has a pretty wide band. You know, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of when the penalties kick in, and that's fair, I think, because it is you know, a month-to-month basis, and so whereas if you have, you know, going back to what I was saying before, we, you know, try to have a balance between the BNLI and the CSP mechanisms and all this to make sure it's, you know, it strikes the right balance of rigor in aggregate. You know, a quarterly approach, I think, would. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But a quarterly approach, I think, is going to, you know, is a good starting point anyhow to strike that balance.
So the 15% basically represents a kind of, since you will be aggregating over a longer period, it should mitigate at least some of the
Smaller band
variability in there. Fair to say CBP or something. Okay.
Yeah. Or at least give you more data points to work with, right? And
Yeah.
As you calculate performance.
Yes, Jill.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to make a clarification. I think you were talking about RAIN, and Luke was describing it. It really is not looking at performance. It's comparing what has been shown as a capacity value for that resource and ensuring that it's bidding to that capacity level. So it's really a penalty in bidding and not performance.
So, Jill, just to clarify, it's really more about making sure that resource is available.
Correct.
Okay.
It's been shown as having a must-offer obligation, and we're expecting to see that obligation met by seeing the bids within the market.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe, for the correction.
You asked earlier for people who made a proposal to chime in, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
The proposal I put together, you know, is not at the monthly level. By design, the performance, alignment metric and the bid alignment metric are done for the whole delivery year, right? And that's to factor in the fact that for any individual month, you often don't see necessarily like the planning condition overall, and you're going to have variability, right? So it's going to factor in, here's all of the info, what is your performance overall? And we explicitly in the proposal recommended aggregation to at least the program level across all the sublabs. Because again, for any individual sublab, you're going to have measurement error, you have variability in performance. And the goal there was really to kind of say, what is really the actual delivery capability? Keeping in mind that the more you aggregate resources, the more stable the numbers become and the more reflective they are of the actual performance. So that was kind of like the DSA version of that when we put together a proposal. It was very explicitly saying, look, you're going to compute both the performance availability metric for the delivery year, same thing for the bid alignment metric, multiply the two, that becomes the performance, overall performance, right? And then you can go ahead and apply that to the slice of day table that got produced ahead of time. And really, when we frame this, we're really keeping in mind the slice of day table, because ultimately that's the new framework. It's not a single value. It really has to be applied to the whole table.
So if in your proposal, if there was an overperformance, it would have to be almost, depending on how many events there were, of course, but it would have to be overperforming on a fairly consistent basis. If it's one episode.
Correct. You have to show overperformance on a very consistent basis all the way through. And obviously, that's a separate part then from the CSP mechanism, right? So if I look at performance being the performance alignment metric times the bid alignment metric, I might come up with a 105 number. Now, if in the revenue / capacity penalty side, people decide to put a cap at 100%, it wouldn't count anyhow, right? So the two discussions, I think Luke pointed out this earlier, interact with each other. Because even if you over delivered, if your rules say, hey, we're going to put a cap that you cannot exceed what you committed, or you put a cap at say 105, then that would be the max you could collect. So the two are going to, the cap comes from the enforcement of the revenue / capacity shortfall calculation.
I would also just chime in on the BNLI paradigm. The aggregation was going to be left up. It is described in the proposal as well. The aggregation could be towards seasons, and that could be defined by DRPs, or I don't know if it was specified sublab level or program level, but there were also considerations on that.
Are there any other specific discussion items we want? Otherwise, I can go to the next steps. I don't see any hand raised at that point, so I'm gonna okay. So our next meeting. Okay, so we have a comment period. So it'll be due on September 29th, which is a week from tomorrow. It should indicate which formula would be most appropriate for use for testing. That I'm, of course, you can comment on the specific items regarding penalties, regarding dead bands, and all that. As I mentioned before, it looks like we have quite a bit of closeness on these various proposals. So just, but an opportunity to comment on the various proposals at that time is available for next week. So the next meeting, which is October 5th at the same time, 3 to 5, we'll have a discussion of the final CSP capacity shortfall penalty. And then we'll start the discussion of the penalty enforcement mechanism, where we'll introduce that with our thoughts and previous discussions on that, and where we think the issues are on that. And I don't have anything else except to thank everybody. But Daniel, did you want to add anything?
I think that covers it.
Okay. Last chance to comment. Anybody? Otherwise.
Oh, sorry. This is Amy from SCE. I apologize.
Oh, no problem.
Are parties invited to make a presentation for the next phase?
So,
or is it just Energy Division and CEC?
So next phase will be Energy Division and CEC with discussion, but
okay.
The meeting after the one on the October 5th, which would be, I guess, October 19th, that is when we would have presentations of proposals or discussions, and so the way, so just maybe I should put this out. October 5th would be the meeting. October 12th, 13th would be a chance for comments on that meeting, and then in various parties' thoughts on it. And then the next week's meeting on the 19th would be when we would discuss the party comments that were provided, with the opportunity to present at that time. If we don't have any other questions, I will send this out to the group after this meeting, this presentation, and hopefully, and we should get the stuff up on the website soon as well. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and I look forward to reading your comments and seeing you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.